tell, I know how much I've looked forward to this, and also been frightened by it. But because I want to make sure that what I tell you, you can receive, and it's all truthful. And I guess I say that because as a child growing up in this community, especially in the schools, I loved history. Now, I didn't major in history, but I loved history. And I can remember one time in one of my classes, and is Margaret? Margaret?
There are 3 Margarets here, but
yes.
you're not talking about me.
Margaret Simon. Okay, so I think Margaret knows, or are there any other social sciences teacher? Oh, Roz, but curriculum specialist. The state has certain guidelines for what is to be taught in the schools. And I can remember, even though it's a long time ago, I can remember going into one of my classes, and I think it's 7th grade, where I was so excited because we were going to go over the history of Iberia Parish. It might have been 9th grade, but I think it was 7th. And I was so disappointed because what they taught us was how our government is organized here in Iberia. You know, the mayor pro tem, the council people, the parish, etc. Now, to me, that wasn't history, but I was just a kid. I mean, what do I know? And they taught us about the Acadians, and who came to this area in about what was it? It was roughly in the mid-1700s. And they taught us about the Canary Islanders who came to this area, founded New Iberia. But there was nothing about the Africans. And I realized as I've gotten older and began to reflect on how history is taught, and I'm going to talk about in Iberia because I think it's kind of systemic throughout, but in Iberia, we teach what we know, right? And if the politicians do not make sure that the standards reflect the true history, then it's not going to make its way into the education of the children. So I left the schools never really understanding the history of Iberia, and really not understanding the place that my people who look like me, have in this community, the roles we played, the experiences that we encountered growing up in Iberia Parish. When I was a little girl, I heard stories from my grandparents, as most of us had. And my grandmother would tell us stories about, like the Titanic, because she was born in 1908, I was born in 06. So she told us about the Titanic and the rumors about the musicians playing Amazing Grace until the ship sank and all that. And she told us about the 1927 flood and how her parents and her family were impacted by it. And she also told us about those wonderful black doctors, which our books in the library excluded, right? And that's another story. So I knew there was some history, but then as a child, I'm thinking our only history is that we were enslaved here, right? Because that must be the only history, and that's why people don't talk about it, because it's not something that you really want to celebrate, and it's a blot on mankind, to be quite honest. It doesn't matter what culture you come from. So I thought I started researching the history of Jean Louis and Alphonse Manuel and Rosalie and Rosa Cato, and I ended up researching the history of my community because the records that I went through were so compelling. They were just reaching out. And because I've always been what my family used to call a nosy child, I wanted to learn more and more and more. And I began to reflect on the stories I heard growing up, which kind of fell in line with what I was seeing. Like my grandmother's telling me about Dr. Scogins and Dr. Dorsey and Dr. Pearson and Dr. Williams, who were beaten in New Iberia in 1944 and thrown out because they dared to advocate for black families who the men just wanted to become welders so they could lift their families up to the middle class and they could enter the oil and gas industry, right? That wasn't allowed until the 1960s in this area. So I found documentation to prove that what my grandparents told me, what I'd heard when they didn't think I was listening, were all true. These were not just family lore or family, stories handed down, family gossip or rumors. So anyway, I began to realize a lot of this, it wasn't just, there were other stories to be explored. And it made me so excited, and I'm still excited. And I want to share some of this with you. For example, there was a civil war. And far as I know, the only thing what I was taught, the only thing the Civil War did was free the slaves. And I'm using the term as it's conventionally used. And we now say enslaved people, but we kind of sanitize it a little bit by saying enslaved people, right? So that's the only thing the Civil War did. But how did it impact my people in Iberia Parish, or what later became Iberia? Well, what I learned, where's Pat? What I learned is that Mary Weeks, at the Shadows, she endured the indignity of the Union Army occupying her home. And she endured it with 3 of her trusted enslaved women, or servants. And she eventually died. Is that correct? Like maybe just days later. But I didn't know how that war, let's start with the women, how it impacted those women, those other women who were in the house. I'm sure they continued to serve, and Pat, I'd like for you to contribute if you can fill that in for me. I'm sure within that environment, within that home when Mary was dying, I'm sure they probably worried about their safety. Because even though this was the Union Army, not all of them were saints, and not all of the Confederates were devils. These were men in difficult times, and sometimes they were not priests, right? And so women were not always safe. So I wonder what those women went through in that house, as well as throughout the community, especially enslaved women. So I wanted to at least take a stab at talking about, having a discussion about what happened in New Iberia when the Union Army occupied New Iberia, and what about Reconstruction? How did it unfold in New Iberia? And I'm going to try to get to Jim Crow, but I can be long-winded. But before I do this, I want to kind of just go over the Civil War. And here's where some of my friends and I, we differ. And that's okay. We have differences of opinion. My opinion, strong opinion, is the war was over slavery. And no one has yet been able to convince me otherwise. I met a very nice gentleman in the library, and he and I were talking, and he said, yeah, he said, but if the war was too complicated to think that it was just about one thing, there were multiple things. And the main problem was that the South resented the North imposing embargoes on its products. And I listened, and he talked about people having, people were very pro-states' rights and, my individual rights, et cetera, et cetera. But my response to him was, but what was it that they were upset about? What was the embargo about? Well, it was like agricultural products. It was like sugarcane and cotton. Well, who grew all that? Who planted it? Who took care of those crops? Who harvested and processed those crops that allowed them to then send those products overseas and to endure the anger, the humiliation of the North imposing this embargo? So again, people can agree, they can disagree. Until I'm convinced, I stand firmly in what I believe. And as I told him, I said, look at me. I know what came down through my family, and as I said before, one of my great-grandfathers said in Creole French that slavery was hell. I can't speak it, but slavery was hell. It was not a picnic, and it doesn't condemn anyone alive today, but I think we all have to be enlightened about what the truth is. And first we start with humanizing the people who were enslaved. They were not things. They were human beings. And I can tell you that because they were my people, right? So I just think we need to start with that. And then we have, sometimes people put distance between themselves and the truth because it's uncomfortable. And that's okay, we're all on a journey. But I just need to make sure that people understand that I have to speak my truth. The Shadows Unlike many other Iberia plantations, and there were a lot. You know, one of my goals is to document all the plantations in what became Iberia Parish, simply because it'll help people like me find the last plantations that their ancestors were enslaved on. But there were a lot. But the Shadows figures prominently in Louisiana Secession from the Union, which I didn't know, and maybe, I know Pat knows, and Jade, but I didn't know this. Judge John Moore actually was the key author of the Louisiana Secession document. And that had a direct impact on his particular family, because his grandson or step-grandson, I believe, actually resigned from college, took up a commission with the Confederacy, and the end result was this young man died on the battlefield. And Judge Moore brought one of his male servants with him to find his step-grandson's body on the battlefield. And the story is that, and Pat, I really want you to correct me if I misspeak something, but the story is that there was such decomposition among those bodies on the field that the only way the manservant could, or the enslaved gentleman, could identify him was through the gold tooth. I think that had his initial. Okay. So, was Jade able to find any of the secession documents?
We found a version of it that is part of a larger document, so I'm assuming you want just standing alone.
Well, here's what we can do. Okay, I just found it interesting to just read some of these actual documents. Louisiana's Ordinance of Secession, you can just Google it, because that's how I found it. And you can just read through it. But reading through it, understanding that it's someone local who basically penned it. You know, so we weren't, you know, just observers of the war. We actually participated. So by the time the Fort Sumter was fired upon in 1861 in South Carolina, Louisiana joined, or at the time it did, Louisiana then joined with the other 16 Confederate states, or states that had agreed to form the Confederacy. 2 years after the start of the war, New Iberia was occupied by the Union Army. And this was due to orders by General Nathaniel Banks, who launched his Tesh campaign. Again, I never heard any of this, but it's very interesting to me. News of the arrival of the Union soldiers spread quickly, and I know a lot of this because I've pulled pension records of my grandfathers, ancestral grandfathers who served, and I've pulled civil records from the courthouse of many of them who sued other family members, or who were sued. And there's testimony that describes what these men went through. When the soldiers left New Iberia, well, before I tell you that, when the soldiers were in New Iberia, they encamped at various spots around what became the parish, right? And so there was some at the Harvey Hopkins plantation, which I want to correct something, I think. Lots of people believe that the Hopkins family were slaveholders. They were not. They actually were Unionists and actually left from this area once the war began. And there were several families in Louisiana and also in New Iberia that were loyal Unionists, and they did not agree to secession. But when the Union soldiers came to New Iberia, several of them encamped there. So I want you to think about it. So here are these patrols that are going out to these different plantations or homesteads or wherever, businesses, and they're taking possession of what those individuals owned that could aid and abet the Confederacy, right? And that's part of what they called, they were authorized through the Contraband Act. And so that authorized them to take anything, be it food, livestock, fuel, human beings. They could just take them. I have a friend over at the Young Sanders Center. We're on the different sides of the fence when it comes to our perception of how the war started. Mm-hmm. He runs the Young Sanders Center, which is all about the war between the states as opposed to the Civil War. That's okay. He's helped me tremendously. Because we can have differences of opinion, but he's helped me tremendously. He drove me to, or no, he followed me, or I followed him, to Bayou Ramos. There's a place in Morgan City off of Highway 70, I think it is. And it doesn't even look as if it's that important because it's just surrounded, there's a bayou here with a bunch of barges that look as if they are abandoned. And then there's some more abandoned oil companies across the street, and a little stream that kind of passes alongside it. And that stream is Bayou Ramos, I understand. And it empties into Lake Palourde, that lake that you see when you're crossing Morgan City Bridge. Well, it was along Bayou Ramos that that encampment, that contraband camp, they call it. That was the first contraband camp that was established once everyone left New Iberia. Now, what do I mean by that? When it was time to move people, to move the soldiers on, the blacks and whites went with them. And by one account, I think it's in Morris Raphael's book, it was a line of like almost 10 miles long, over 6,000 people. And that's massive to me. And it's like, well, how did they get all those people? Well, they went by wagon train. Some walked, some rode horses, some rode in wagons, and they rode mules, etc. When they got to and along the way, they picked up people, who wanted to leave. Now, what I didn't know, after doing some readings, thinking that this was only blacks who they were helping, what I didn't know that there were many whites who were part of this, and they were considered to be refugees, right? The blacks were considered to be contraband, still property. But along the way, they picked up other people, and they were told, because it was a Contraband Camp Act or whatever, they were told that if you accompany us, you are responsible for certain duties. And that included black and white. Now, why were there whites? Because the war devastated this area. When people, it didn't matter what you had. Even if you were a Union loyalist, if it was thought that the Confederacy could come in and take what you have to aid and abet the Confederacy, they would take it. The soldiers had a tremendous need for food and for fuel, et cetera, et cetera. So all of that was confiscated. So there wasn't a whole lot here. So everyone was suffering. So when with the camps, the conditions of the camps were not ideal, but those families, like a lot of refugee camps today, they still chose those conditions over staying in their original condition of bondage. There are some diaries that have been written about what was encountered when people went to the camp at Morgan City, at Brashear City, and they talked about disease, hunger, dead bodies, because they couldn't bury them for whatever reason and they kind of decomposed. It was a refugee camp. And I've never gone to a modern day refugee camp, but I'll bet it's not that different from what we're talking about. Some of the activities in the contraband camp or the refugee camp, they used the camp as an opportunity to recruit young men. President Lincoln was finally convinced to allow black men to join the Union Army, Union Navy, the military. And that was a game changer. As Dr. Vinson said last week, the Union, the state of Louisiana sent the most blacks to the Union military. And the Union, it was a game changer because it was because of these black men who joined the military. They were able to aid the Union Army and aid the federal government in winning this war. Federal agents were sent to contraband camps to recruit these young men, and among them were the people I'm descended from. And I think I have like maybe 7 of my ancestors I've been able to identify so far who served in the Union, either the Navy or the Army. Corps d'Afrique is what it was called initially. Later given the name of United States Colored Infantry or United States Colored Troops. It was interesting though, in this area as opposed to say a Mississippi or a South Carolina, it was kind of difficult to record the names, because you know that with most individuals who were enslaved, they didn't have a surname. Now some did. Some of my ancestors came with surnames because they came from the East Coast, right? But when they came here, there were people who didn't, most of them did not have surnames. So what the recruiter would say is, what is your last name? The individual would say, I don't have a last name. And then what they did, the practice was, well, who was your last master? And then they would say it, right? So as an example, I have a 2 times great-grandfather named Alphonse Manuel. And Alphonse was owned by Eugene Henry Wallet. And Eugene Henry Wallet's one of his granddaughters, and probably a great-great-granddaughter, Patty, and I are good friends. I've actually gone to Oregon to visit with her and her family. But so Eugene Henry Wallet, so because my ancestors did not speak very good English, and by the way, he spoke French, but he spoke French coming from the Congo. So when he was asked, what is your name? The guy couldn't really understand him. So his name went down as Alphonse Wiley. So, and then I had another ancestor, Jean Louis, and his name, the recruiter wrote down as John Broussard, because his last owner was Éloi Josephat Broussard. And so he just gave him the last name of his owner, and then he anglicized Jean. So what happened as a result, when my ancestors and others like them, after the war is over and they're eligible, they apply for their pensions, right? But they apply for their pensions using their real names, because in 1870, as all over in the Confederacy here, people were legally required to come up with a surname. So Alphonse Manuel, he was just known as Alphonse, and he had to prove that he was the same Alphonse Manuel that lived on the plantation, Eugene Henry Wallet plantation, and that he was just given this name by the recruiter. And Jean had to do the same. So how could they prove who they were? There were no records. Well, they had to get depositions. They had to bring in people who could attest to who they were. And so those are very rich for people like me who are trying to trace their people. So there were people who they brought in who said, I grew up in the community with Jean Louis, with Jean, the soldier who is now named or known as Jean Louis. And we grew up as boys. And by his Creole community, he was known as blank. So they were able to kind of give a history of who these men were, and that they actually were members of the same regiment, and actually they grew up on the same plantation. So that's what men had to go through in order to get those pensions, which I'm grateful for now, because that's how I was able to confirm who some of my grandmothers were, and because they had to say, who was your mother, or who was your father? And that helped me tremendously in terms of doing genealogy or genealogical research with my people. After, and y'all can stop me, because I've been told I can't put everything, including the dishwasher, in this presentation. but it's to give you a flavor, an idea of the fact that this history that we may have touched on in school, it pertained to this area. If I understood as a child in school, I may have gone and majored in history because I was that close. But if I understood how real this history was and how it impacted me and my community, that would have been so empowering for me, so exciting for me. But I'm just saying this so you all can think, especially as you go out and you have grandchildren or children, you can make sure that they're getting the proper education. Which, by the way, as I had another conversation in a coffee shop with someone, we have to keep reading. and I know I'm talking to the choir with this group, but you know, if we only, as I told this gentleman, if we only rely on what we were taught in schools, we're undereducated. We'll never grow. Our brains will just continue to shrink because we have to continue to read and absorb information on our own. And we have to meet with people and we have to talk about those things that we are reading and we are thinking about. That's how we grow. Reconstruction immediately followed the end of the Civil War. And go back to what I was taught. As a little girl, I was taught that Reconstruction, in most of my classes, it was the worst thing that happened to the South. And so I'm a little girl. That's what my teachers said. I believed what they said. And I know now that's not true. That was part of that conspiracy that, what is that? It'll come back to me. But after the war, there was a concerted effort to change the way people looked at the Confederates. That it wasn't a rebellion of people who were traitors. They were actually loyal to the concept of liberty, right? And so there was an effort to sanitize that history with all those hundreds of thousands of lives lost. So I've learned that I have to think for myself. Reconstruction is exactly what it says it is. It is an effort to go in once an area has been destroyed, devastated, harmed by war, to rebuild it. Not just to rebuild the buildings, you know, the structures, but to rebuild the economy. And that meant here in Louisiana, to rebuild the agriculture. So part of the Reconstruction Act, I think it was of 1867, was to bring in, to figure out how to make sure that the former enslaved people, who at that point became known as freedmen, not freedmen and freedwomen, which I always made that mistake. All of them were called freedmen. And so the freedmen and their families, how they could be transitioned to become wage earners as opposed to being bonded, you know, enslaved, forced laborers. And so the Freedmen's Bureau was established, and it was established not just to help the former enslaved, the freedmen, but also to help the whites who had been harmed by and that included the planters. But it had been formed to help rebuild the economies, get those farmers back and, you know, rebuilding their fields, giving wages to the people who before had been forced to work in the sugarcane fields and the cotton fields, etc. So I don't see how that can be terrible. Now, in this area, well, before I go there, I do want to say about Freedmen's Bureau. There were other things that happened. First, part of the Freedmen's, or the Reconstruction Act required that the former Confederate states pledged an oath of loyalty before they would be readmitted to the Union. And there were people like the Patu family, who owned the Enterprise Plantation. She sued the federal government for, because she wanted the return of properties, and she wanted to be reimbursed for monies lost. And of course she lost. She argued that she was a French citizen, and then people did those kinds of things. There were all kinds of things that people did after the war was lost to try to get compensated for losses, lost properties, lost wages, whatever. So for them to be able to be reimbursed, they had to prove loss, and they had to prove that they were loyal to the federal government, which a lot of them couldn't. The Southern Claims Commission oversaw a lot of that. There is one gentleman with a family that most of you who know me, you know I've been studying the Wakefields, because Margaret, right? Margaret and I have a book that we're putting out regarding Emma Wakefield and her family. And we're holding our breath and waiting patiently. But it's such an incredible family. This family story is the story of slavery here, because I was recently able to confirm that Sam Wakefield really had been born in slavery, but yet he was so well educated. If you see his handwriting, it is beautiful, you know. And immediately after slavery ended, this man became an agent of the federal government. He worked for the Southern Claims Commission. He worked for the Freedmen Bureau, you know, but he was enslaved. And so the Southern Claims Commission, if people had these claims against the federal government, they went through them. One of the things that Sam Wakefield as an agent did, when someone went up to say that I was a loyal unionist, they brought in witnesses. Sam was a witness to 2 cases that I saw, and one he agreed. He testified that the man really was loyal. He had never gone to secession meetings. And the other one, he said, I've known him 35 years, and he's always been of a mind to secede from the Union. He attended every secession meeting. You know, he encouraged young men in the community to join, I think it was Fontalou's unit or militia. There were names for these different groups. So Sam outed him, and so he didn't get the reimbursement or the compensation. I mentioned the loyalty oaths. Reconstruction, the beginning, the Reconstruction Act of 1867 is, it was called Radical Reconstruction. And at first I didn't really understand, because remember I'm having to read and teach myself, right? I didn't understand the idea of radical, but it really was radical. These people who adhered to that philosophy, they wanted complete citizenship for the blacks who had been enslaved. They wanted them to immediately be given the right to vote. They wanted them to, they wanted no segregation, right? And that lasted for a little while. The Congress in 1867 passed the Reconstruction Act, and that kind of formalized it. And in that act, one of the things they did was require each Confederate state, former Confederate state, to establish or create a new constitution. And Louisiana's Constitution of 1868, I think it was, is still considered to have been the most progressive constitution of the South, because our children would have been able to go to desegregated schools. There would be no segregated public transportation or housing. Black men would vote, et cetera, et cetera. And the groups, there were, of course, the Republicans and the Democrats. The Republican Party, there was a faction called the Radical Republicans who really pushed for this radical Reconstruction agenda. And so men, black men like a Samuel Wakefield, Charles DeQueer, who became our first, he became our second black postmaster. There were several prominent black men in this community who attained or acquired, were appointed to political and public service positions. But these men were mostly Republicans. So what were the Democrats of the day? What were they afraid of? And it just boggles my mind. They were afraid that with the radical Republicans pushing this social agenda, civil agenda, that blacks would always get them in office. Sort of like the way things are now. That's what they were afraid of. So there was a lot of pushback and violence among the groups. Even here, one of my friends said, well, I'm glad this stuff didn't happen in New Iberia. Oh, yeah, it did.
Yes, it did.
Oh, and she said, but Phebe, I don't remember here. I said, okay, we were a Jim Crow community. Yes. If you are in a former Jim Crow community, how do you think they enforced it? Yeah. It was through violence and intimidation. Okay, either you lost your life, you lost your job, or you were just expelled from the community. Like about 11 or 12 men were expelled in 1889 because Sammy Wakefield, who is the junior, he's the son of our Senator Samuel Wakefield Sr., he killed James Traynor, and he admitted it. And I'll tell you that story in a little bit. So there was violence. And I came across, and most of you may know this already, I just thought this, I'm not going to quote it because I'm going to mess it up, but George Washington was strongly against a two-party system because he felt that it would cause people to be loyal to party and not to country. And I'm going, why do they listen to him for some things and not everything? Because, yeah. So there were major conflicts between the Republicans and the Democrats. And violence. Violence was the order of the day. There were massacres here. And people try to say, again, we were a good and calm and peaceful community. There's a little community called Freetown around the Koto area. Yeah? And there are still houses with bullet holes because the family members who own them will not cover them. It's their proof, their history. And actually that particular community, I've been talking to them about putting a marker out there in front of the church because it's a story that has been researched or that is being researched. Dr. Michael Wade at Appalachian University has been very interested in this story. And it's all about this factional violence that went on. Reconstruction was a time of education building for the children of the freedmen and the families of the, because there were adults who had been enslaved who wanted to learn to read and write. Now that's pitiful, but it's not when you think about it. These people, a lot of them were legally denied access to an education, to literacy, just to learn how to read and write and count numbers, right? But there were northern congregations and philanthropists who saw it as their mission to come to the South, and thank God that they came to Louisiana, and they founded schools, and they founded churches. And one of the first church, congregational church, that was established in Louisiana is at the corner of French and Pershing.
St. Paul.
That's the old St. Paul Congregational Church. Now, it's not named that anymore.
No, right.
Because that congregation was too small to survive after a while. But the structure, well, the second structure is still there.
There's still a cornerstone from the original one.
You know what happened to the first one?
It was burned.
Burned.
It was burned.
Oh, that's right. Yeah. And if you read the newspaper articles, it was burned by it was an incendiary and it was intentional. It was an intentional fire. This is in the 1870s. But this wasn't unusual during that period, because again, we're still talking Reconstruction. Reconstruction was a violent period. But wait until we get to Jim Crow. The Jim Crow era began in the 1870s, and it was a direct pushback or backlash to Reconstruction. The efforts of the government and others, church leaders and what have you, to make things right for the former enslaved, the freedmen and their families. They saw it as they were going to lose ground. They were going to lose something, power, something, by making sure that these poor black people got decent housing, got food, got jobs, you know, so it was a threat. So with the election of sympathizers to the Southern agenda, I think it starts with Johnson, Reconstruction was ended, and a period of Jim Crow segregation began. Oh, and I forgot to say, what time, am I over? Oh, I forgot to say this. Those Reconstruction amendments that defined to me this country, the 13th, freeing the Africans, the 14th, granting citizenship, the 15th, granting suffrage. Every effort was made to overturn those through Jim Crow. And even when you think, well, how could they put people back in slavery? They did. They did. Because they found ways to take children, boys, off the street and bring them to Angola, especially during the grinding season. Men, grown men, who may have been given a fine for something, because they represented free labor, they could take them and put them in prison because the Constitution did say that you take away their rights, right? That was legal, it was just if they were convicted of some crime. So they just used all kinds of different ways. And then there's the book, what is it, another?
Slavery by Another Name.
Slavery by Another Name, thank you. Slavery by Another Name.
Yeah.
It breaks my heart. What happened after slavery, especially in the 20th century on, to me is more painful than slavery because we should know better. But it was still a motivation of money because these plantation owners, they conspired with the prison officials to get this free labor. And I don't care how you cut it, you can't erase the truth. I got away too fast from the lynchings. I wanted to tell you about, okay, so Sam Wakefield was our first senator, well, our only black senator elected from this area, right? And he was a Republican. He was a radical Republican. He died in 1883, supposedly by suicide. I don't understand it, but he shot himself twice in the head. First bullet went to the back of the ear, lodged in the neck. I don't get that. Why wasn't he unconscious? And the brother-in-law who said he witnessed it said he saw him rise up and then point the gun at his head and blow his brains out. I don't get that. But remember, there's a lot of violence. There are a lot of threats going on during this period. In 1889, and I have a picture of his cute little face, his son, who's Sammy Jr., who was on break from school in New Orleans. He was a student at Straight University in New Orleans. And he was working at a business on Main Street, somewhere around the Episcopal Church. And his employer told him to go and get a door. And so he went to the O.J. Traynor Window and Sash Company, or whatever it's called. And the gentleman in there, according to this young boy, beat him, or he stabbed at him, but he assaulted him. And according to the young man, he went home to his family, and they lived right off on St. Peter Street, right down from Mesh's Donuts in that block. And he told his mother and his big brother, who had just served his term as our clerk of court, Adolph Wakefield, what had happened. His brother said, go back to work, don't return to that store. I'll take care of it. Now remember, this family is powerful and they're well connected. The boy did as his brother told him, who by the way was his godfather also. I got that from St. Peter. But he did what his brother told him, and on the way home he encountered Traynor. And he took, before he did what his brother told him, he went upstairs and got his revolver. And he encountered Traynor, and he told Traynor that, sir, you offended me, and I demand satisfaction, just like the movies. At least that's their account in the paper. And the gentleman of some accounts said there was no provocation. Many accounts, newspaper accounts, say there was no provocation. Remind me to tell you what I think about the newspapers of the day. But some accounts said there was no provocation. This imp, because he was a small boy, this imp just killed this fine, upstanding citizen. Others say that he stabbed at him, or he attempted to assault him again, and it was self-defense, and the boy killed him. And he left. The sheriff at the time and the deputy brought him back. Now sometimes these accounts of the sheriff fighting hard to protect the prisoner, it's just a wink, right? But I don't know. It sounds as if this sheriff and deputy, because they were beaten up and one knocked unconscious, that they did try to protect the boy. But while they were fighting, someone shot him through the heart with a rifle. His mother is on St. Peter, and the murder, or the lynching, because it is a lynching, because it's vigilante justice, and that occurred in what we now know as Buluni Plaza, where his sister's marker is, right? Because it happened 5 steps, I think the description is, from the jail. And the jail was adjacent to the city hall or the courthouse, whatever it was that was in there. So Sammy died instantly when that happened. So, and he was 16, or sometimes they say 16, sometimes they say 17 years old. Just a dumb kid. Well, hell broke loose here in New Iberia. That's why, to me, we can't hide who we were as a community, so we can see who we are and how much we've progressed. And how, you know, anyway, so I should have brought this poster. The citizens, the good citizens of New Iberia hung a poster, and they put them up all around town saying the following, I don't remember, they said Negroes or undesirables, get out of town by, I'm going to say noon tomorrow. And I think that's what it was. And they listed these maybe 11 or 12 black men. And the newspapers around the country, a lot of them, they depicted these men who were on the list as being undesirables. And the Negroes of the community, or they say good riddance to this, this bad element, but they were teachers, they were business owners, they were former, his brother, the former clerk, was on the list. That's A.J. Wakefield. L.J. McGoffey, who was on one of the early school boards, he was on the list. These were the ne'er-do-wells, who they said that the Negroes of New Iberia or the colored people of New Iberia are so happy that they got rid of this bad element. They had the so-and-so Dautrieve owned, and his son Yellow Dan owned this Negro dive on Main Street. So they used all of this as an excuse to go in and take those properties. They beat them in. That's why when I grew up in my lifetime, I didn't know anything about black people owning businesses in this historic area, and certainly not in New Iberia, until Miss Helen Johnson opened up her restaurant on Main Street. Now I don't know whether she owned it or not, but that was my first time knowing of anyone of color having a business on Main Street. But there were businesses. I looked at some of the old Sanborn maps, because you know they'll put like a little square colored restaurant or colored pharmacy. People's Drugstore was on Main Street near the Episcopal Church. When I grew up, the People's Drugstore that I knew of was on Hopkins. Well, everything was moved, right? So to me, this helps me as an adult, having grown up here. It helps me to understand the community that I grew up in. And it helps me to understand the people that I come from. They were contributors to this community, and they were professionals, and they were just simple people just trying to make a living. They were men who just wanted to enter the oil industry so they could lift their families up to the middle class in 1944, when white men had been doing that all along. And yet they could not access that middle class in large numbers until the 1960s, in my lifetime, when I was getting ready to go to college. And that's insane. I still wonder what our community economically and socially would be like if everyone had access to that middle class way back when. Who told people that it was okay to deny access to the middle class? That much less money that's circulated here. So anyway, that's one of my pet peeves. Oh, I was going to tell you about the newspapers. The newspapers of the day, a lot of them were tools. They were propaganda tools of the planners and of the former Confederates and the segregationists. So it's like if something happened between blacks and whites, I promise you, the blacks were always the perpetrators. They were always the ones who did the wrong. And they were never humanized in these stories, except I've come across great stories like Chastity Pope. When she died, they wrote this very nice obituary of her, and how they did it, why they did it, because she had been enslaved at the Shadows. And Chastity Pope, and I think she was like in her 90s, right, Pat? something like that. She was an elderly lady living on Week Street with her daughter and her son-in-law. But she was owned by Mr. Charles C. Weeks. Now, what is it that I'm picking up that you may or may not pick up? This elderly lady is Chastity. She was owned by Charles. So I always take what I read with a grain of salt, except as I began to read, there were some newspapers, like in Donaldsonville, that really began to stand up and speak against the lynchings. And they spoke against the beatings and the intimidation. And that all, because I'm always looking for some reason to have hope that things were beginning to change. So, anyway, I think that's the end of my presentation. Do y'all have any questions? Wait until the book comes out. Well, I guess I could have talked about Dr. Wakefield. Oh, no, I didn't talk about Sam's lynching. I'm sorry, James's lynching. James Rosamond. He was hung from the Superior Street Bridge. I think they called it, okay, what we call, at least I call Superior Street.
By Mount Carmel?
Yes, by Mount Carmel. It's not called?
It's Bridge Street.
Bridge Street, thank you. And sometimes I would wonder if I'm really listening to the words of human beings. There were court cases that came about as a result of his lynching and Sammy's lynching, and some of the testimonies, and they knew who did it, who did these atrocities, but they were very prominent men in the community. And there was some testimony that said, well, the body swung, and they made sure that they cut it down before because they didn't want the body to offend the ladies on their way to Mass. And I'm thinking, who are these people? Who are these people? So but those are the kinds of things that really happened. And with Sammy, this is 1889. Rosamond was killed, and he was one of the ones on the list that was told to leave. His wife testified that the men came to her home, and she told them she had not seen him for a couple of days. Well, he left, and he came back to get some. He took the chance of coming back to get some personal items, and they caught him, and they murdered him. So again, history is what it is. Everyone, like someone said, you're not angry. Well, everyone I would be angry with, they're dead. And so I just want us as a community to, one, learn that we are no better than any other community, and to join us in seeking the truth. And I'll tell you, I'm not a historian. My degrees are not in history. Maybe in my next life. But I've tried to get other historians interested. I'm still working on Dr. Vincent, and Adam Fairclough is the gentleman who wrote the story about the 4 black doctors' expulsion. He is interested. I just want people to write our story and write it from the position of truth and objectivity, and that's it. And you all know what we're trying to do with the Shadows. We're doing the reinterpretation of the Shadows' history, which to me is so exciting. The trust, the Shadows staff, that's Pat and Jade, are outstanding in terms of getting this done. They have much courage. But who has to be worried about telling the truth, right? So we've been invited to take up residency on the 2nd floor, and we hope to turn that into a community space, thanks to people who have helped us to realize the stream. And we are going to open it up so people can access those pension records and what have you. And I'm gonna stop.